She was supposed to be coming home Thursday. 2 days early, changed flight, didn't text Connor because she wanted to see his face when she walked through the door. Celia's daycare had called her cell that morning, a low fever, nothing serious. But Darcy had been 900 miles away in Denver, sitting in a conference hotel ballroom, while her daughter asked the daycare teacher if Mama was coming back, and that question had moved through her like a splinter. She'd changed her flight before she even consciously decided to. The drive from O'Hare was ordinary. Tuesday night, light traffic, Chicago in November, moving past the cab window in that particular kind of dark. She had a small speech half assembled in her head, nothing elaborate. Something that just said, "I missed you both. I'm back. Let's be home tonight." She had a key. She let herself in quietly because Celia was probably already asleep, and she didn't want to wake her before she'd even taken off her coat. What she heard, she understood before she had words for it. She stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them the way she counted seconds when she needed a patient to hold still. Just breathe, stay right here. Her travel bag was still on her shoulder. Her coat was still buttoned. She had on the small gold earrings Whitney had given her for her birthday 3 years ago, a detail she would only register later when she was taking them off in a gas station bathroom in Indiana and dropped them in the trash without ceremony. She walked to the bedroom door. She needed to be certain. That was the only explanation she could give herself afterward for why she opened it. She needed the evidence to be absolute. The kind that cannot be argued with. The kind you can't convince yourself you misread. Connor's face when he saw her was something she tried not to revisit. It moved through his features like a system failure. Everything going offline at once. And Whitney's face was worse, because Whitney looked almost relieved, and Darcy never fully understood what that meant, and eventually she stopped trying. 3 seconds, she counted those too. Then she stepped back, pulled the door shut, walked down the hall to Celia's room, cracked the door open, stood in the frame long enough to see the rise and fall of her daughter's breathing under the dinosaur blanket. Fine. She was fine. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. Not because she wanted it, because she needed something with a task attached to it, something that required her hands. She stood at the counter and listened to the coffee maker and did not feel what she was going to feel later. That was a deliberate decision, or it felt like one, though she had never been entirely sure whether what she did in that kitchen was actual control, or just a delay so complete it passed for control. Connor came out first. His hair was a disaster. He had the expression of a man holding 100 explanations who had forgotten every single one of them. Darce. Don't. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'm not asking you to explain. I'm asking you not to speak while I finish this. He stopped. Whitney appeared in the doorway a moment later, wrapped in the throw blanket from the living room couch, the one Darcy's mother had quilted, and something about that particular detail crossed a line that the other things hadn't. Darcy looked at her for one long, level moment. I can't think of a single word you could start with right now that would be worth finishing, she said. So please don't. The silence had texture. Darcy poured her coffee out. She hadn't actually wanted it. She'd needed the making of it. Rinsed the mug, dried it with the dish towel, hung the towel back on the oven handle. She picked up her travel bag. She went to Celia's room. She lifted her daughter out of bed without fully waking her. She'd done it 1,000 times, Celia's head heavy on her shoulder, the small, specific weight of a sleeping 4-year-old, and she walked out. Connor had followed her to the hallway. Where are you going? It's almost midnight. You can't just... I just did, she said, and she closed the front door behind her. She drove to her colleague Sasha's apartment. Sasha opened the door at midnight in her bathrobe, took one look at Darcy's face and Celia asleep against her shoulder, and said, "Couch or guest room?" "Guest room," Darcy said. "Please." She got Celia settled, then sat on the edge of the guest bed in the dark. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this, the way she noticed symptoms, clinically, from a distance. Her face was completely still. Her hands were doing the work her face had refused. She did not cry, not yet. She would later, in the car in Sasha's parking garage the following evening, with the windows up and Celia inside watching cartoons, 38 minutes of it, the ugly kind, the kind she would never have performed in front of anyone, but not yet. What she did instead was open her email. There was a message from Seattle Children's Hospital she'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. A department position, outpatient pediatrics, a step up from her current role in every direction. She had applied in September, in a moment of what she'd called idle ambition, the kind you entertain without intending to act on. She'd told no one except Sasha. She hadn't told Connor because she'd already decided she wasn't going to take it. She had a life in Chicago, a home, a plan. She read the offer. She replied within 15 minutes. The next 72 hours were the most organized she had ever been. She made lists. She worked through them the way she worked through a differential diagnosis, systematically, one item at a time, feelings filed under later. She called Connor only once, to say she was taking Celia and that she needed him out of the house by Saturday so she could pack. He tried to talk. She listened for 45 seconds, heard nothing new and said, "I'll have my attorney reach out." Then she hung up. She did not call Whitney. She had nothing to say to Whitney that she trusted herself to say out loud with Celia 2 rooms away. She told Celia they were going on an adventure. Celia, who was 4 and had not yet learned to read the tension in rooms, said she wanted to bring her stuffed bear named Gerald and her entire crayon collection. Darcy said absolutely yes to both. Their flight to Seattle left on a Sunday morning. Darcy was at the airport 2 hours early, which was excessive, but the rental apartment she'd been staying in since Thursday had become airless somewhere around 4 a.m. She sat at the gate with Celia asleep across her lap and thought about the shape of things. She was 32. She had a clinical degree she'd finished while pregnant, a daughter she was astonishing at raising, a job offer from one of the best children's hospitals in the country, and a bruise around her heart that was going to take considerably longer than a cross-country flight to become something she could understand. She had trusted 2 people completely. Both had handled that trust the same way, carelessly, like something that didn't require maintenance. She was not going to become smaller because of it. She was aware that was an option. She'd seen it happen, the way certain griefs pulled inward until the person doing the grieving became a compressed, careful version of themselves, all the edges filed down. She'd seen it and found it understandable, and had decided, sitting in that airport gate with her sleeping daughter and her single check bag, that she was not going to do that. She didn't have a plan. She just had the decision. She held it like you hold a railing in the dark, not because you know where it leads, but because it's there. The plane lifted off at 7:40 in the morning. Celia slept. Darcy watched Chicago go small beneath them. Somewhere over Wisconsin, she felt something shift in her chest. Not better, not even close to better, but different, like a chapter had actually ended, rather than just paused. She closed her eyes. Seattle was gray and cold and had never heard of her. That was the first thing she noticed. Arriving in a city that had no idea who she was or what had happened to her was not a comfort exactly, but it was a relief. Nobody here knew her name in that particular way, the sympathetic way, the careful around her way. She was just a woman with a carry-on and a 4-year-old who needed to find the rental car counter. She found it. The house they rented was half a block from a park with enormous fir trees that Celia immediately decided were for climbing. The kitchen had a window that looked out onto the neighbor's garden, where a very old tabby cat sat in the same spot every morning like a small gray monument. Celia named him Captain. The cat had no interest in this whatsoever. The hospital was everything the offer had implied, demanding, well-resourced, full of people who had sacrificed other things for the work in the way that reveals itself quietly over lunch tables and in on-call rooms. Dr. Harmon, who ran the outpatient department, had a reputation for being exacting and without patience for approximation. She also had a reputation, among people who'd actually worked for her, for a different quality that never made it into her professional biography. She paid attention, not the performative kind. the real kind. At their first one-on-one, she looked at Darcy's file for 3 minutes without speaking. "Your patient outcomes in Chicago were excellent," she said finally. "Your documentation is meticulous. Your transfer notes are some of the clearest I've received from any incoming provider." She looked up. "What happened?" "I'm sorry?" "Something happened. Nobody leaves a good position mid-school year with a 4-year-old and a single checked bag without a reason." She said it without cruelty. "You don't have to tell me, but it will affect your work one way or another, and I'd rather know which way." Darcy had not been asked this directly. She had not been prepared for how straightforwardly human it would feel. "My marriage ended," she said badly. Harmon nodded once. "Then you're either running from something or toward something. Figure out which one it is as fast as you can. Running from has about a 6-month runway. Running toward can sustain indefinitely." She picked up her pen. "See you Friday rounds." Darcy stood in the hallway outside the office for a moment, breathing through her nose. Then she went back to work. Reese Park had the office 2 doors down from hers. She registered him the first week. Quiet, thorough, brought his lunch from home in the kind of container that suggested actual planning. He was working on adolescent care transitions and had the specific quality of someone who listened to understand rather than to respond, which she noticed because it was rarer than it should have been. He did not, in those first weeks, try to befriend her. She noticed that and was quietly grateful for it. Her capacity for new trust was essentially at 0. The people who understood that and gave her room were vastly preferable to the ones who treated her guardedness as a puzzle to dismantle. One afternoon in January, she dropped her badge in the stairwell and it slid under the bottom step where she couldn't reach it. She made a sound of low, specific frustration, and Reese, coming down from the floor above, crouched beside the step without being asked and retrieved it and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said. "Yep," he said, and continued down the stairs. She thought about that exchange for 2 days afterward, which told her something unflattering about the current state of her expectations of other people. Back in Chicago, Connor was apparently struggling. She knew this not because she looked for it, but because Sasha mentioned it carefully in a text. He'd been calling mutual friends, looking for information about where she'd gone. Darcy read the text, replied "Thanks for letting me know," and put her phone face down. She had allowed herself, in the small dark hours of those first weeks in Seattle, to imagine him waking up to silence, to absence. She had imagined the calls she wasn't answering. In her most honest moments, she'd admitted she wanted him to be suffering. She did not feel satisfied by Sasha's message. She felt tired. The rupture came in March. She had built, carefully, a functional working relationship with Beverly, the clinic's care coordinator, 15 years at Seattle Children's, the kind of institutional competence that makes everyone around her run slightly better without knowing why. They ate lunch sometimes. Darcy had started to relax around her in the limited, calibrated way she was allowing herself to relax around anyone. Then a former colleague from Chicago called, someone careful enough to call rather than text. "There's something circulating," he said, "about your records." It took her 3 days to find it. A post on a nurses' professional forum, the kind of semi-public space where credentials and grievances mixed in roughly equal measure. The account was 3 weeks old. The post questioned whether certain patient outcome records attributed to Darcy in a co-authored study had been accurately documented, implied possible inflation of data, and asked, in the particular language of investigative reluctance, whether someone should look into her fitness to practice. It was specific. That was the thing that distinguished it from ordinary resentment. It cited dates, case numbers, the journal name. It had been written by someone who knew her work closely enough to use exactly the right vocabulary. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She was not panicking. She identified this as a choice, then recognized it wasn't entirely a choice. She'd been here before, not with this particular thing, but with the quality of it. The moment when the worst possible version of a situation arrives and you find out what you're actually made of. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Weston, her co-author on the Chicago study, a pediatrician with 15 years of independent records on every line of that research. "I have everything," he said before she finished explaining. "Every draft, every IRB file, every peer review comment. I'll send them now." She spent the next 6 nights building the archive. Not because the accusation was credible to anyone who actually looked, but because she understood, with the cold precision that fear sometimes produces, that documentation mattered more than credibility. She pulled everything: original case files, research notes with timestamps, IRB correspondence, independent peer review records, the chain of attribution from raw data to published conclusion, unbroken. She built it the way she built care plans, not to persuade, but to make error structurally impossible. Reese found her in the break room at 11:30 on the 4th night. Documents open on her laptop, 3 empty coffee cups arranged in an unintentional row. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked at the screen, at the cups, and said, "You haven't eaten." "I haven't noticed." He opened the cabinet where people kept their meal prep containers, found leftover soup he'd brought for his own lunch that day, heated it up, and set it beside her laptop without fanfare. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He sat down across from her, opened his phone, and did his own work. She ate. They didn't talk much. It was the best she'd felt in a week. She found the source 11 days later. She hadn't been forcing it. She'd been focused on the documentation and the institutional response, but a part of her had been holding the question of origin the way she held difficult diagnoses. Not forcing, just creating conditions for the answer to surface. It surfaced as an email from a number she didn't recognize. No text. One attachment, a screenshot of a conversation thread on a professional social platform she recognized from the Chicago medical scene. The names on the thread were visible. One of them was Whitney. She read the thread 3 times. Whitney and another account, someone connected to the forum where the post had appeared, discussed, in the specific language of people who had done real research rather than casual gossip, the exact details that had ended up in the accusation. Case numbers, study terminology, the publishing journal's name. These were not things found through public records. These were things you knew because you had sat across from someone at dinner for 9 years and listened to them talk about their work with their guard completely down. Darcy set her phone face down on the desk. She was very still. She thought about Whitney's face in the bedroom doorway, that look that had seemed like relief. She thought about the apology email Whitney had sent 2 months after Darcy left, which Darcy had read once and filed without answering. "I'm sorry. I know this doesn't fix anything. I just need you to know." She had taken that as a closing, a door she'd thought she'd shut cleanly. This was not a door that had been shut. This was someone still writing in the chapter Darcy thought she'd closed. Someone who had watched from a distance, waited until Darcy was most visible and most professionally exposed, and then built something designed to land exactly there. The apology had been real, maybe. Or it had been reconnaissance. Maybe it had been both, which was the version that was hardest to hold. She forwarded the screenshot to Dr. Harmon, to the hospital's legal office, and to Dr. Weston, with one line, "Origin identified. Please advise." Then she called Reese. "Are you free tonight?" "Yes." "Can I come over? I need to think out loud." "I'll put coffee on," he said. She laid everything out on his kitchen table. The email, the screenshots, the thread, the timeline, connecting the post to its source and to the specific window of maximum professional damage. He read through it in order, in silence, turning each page with the deliberate attention of someone who understood this mattered to the person showing it. When he finished, he looked up. She planned this. Yes, she knew about the department position. It was in the hospital's public announcement. But the specific details in that post, the case numbers, the study language. 9 years, he said. She knew everything. Darcy pressed her fingertips against the table edge. "I need legal to move. I need the documentation released before this gets any further. She stopped. What she had been about to say was, I need to not have believed that apology, even privately. She recognized the sentence as the beginning of a spiral that would cost her days she didn't have. I need this to be over, she said instead. Reese put his hand on the table, not on hers, just there available. She looked at it. Then she placed her hand over his. It will be, he said. She wasn't quite there yet, but the wanting to believe him was real, and the hand under hers was warm, and outside his window the Seattle rain was doing what it always did, steady and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with any of this. And there was something relieving about that indifference, the way the city just kept going. The legal process moved efficiently once it had the evidence. The hospital released Darcy's full documentation. Dr. Weston issued a statement. The research institution confirmed the integrity of every attribution. The forum post came down. The account that had seeded and amplified it was traced, not publicly, but sufficiently for institutional purposes, to connections that led directly back to Whitney. Professional consequences arrived without drama, the kind that come as a change in temperature rather than a confrontation, a contract not renewed, a reference withheld, a name that circulated now with a question permanently attached. Darcy was not the one who administered them. She provided the record, and the record did the work. She was in her office when the legal coordinator called to summarize the outcome. She listened, thanked them, hung up, sat with it. She had told no one she was doing this to punish Whitney. She had meant that, and she meant it now, which made the sitting, with harder than simple satisfaction would have been. She didn't feel glad that Whitney's professional standing had been damaged. She felt glad the record was clean and complete. Those two things were related but not the same, and the space between them was where she had to live with what had happened. Not just the accusation, but the 9 years before it, the friendship she'd once treated as permanent, and the specific series of choices that had turned it into what it became. She couldn't compress that into something clean. She had stopped trying. She went home, picked Celia up from school. They made pasta together, which meant Celia stirred the sauce while Darcy managed the boiling water, and Celia narrated the entire process for Gerald the stuffed bear, who was propped against the fruit bowl in a position of apparent authority. Darcy watched her daughter explain al dente to a stuffed animal and felt something she hadn't expected, ordinary gladness, not the qualified, managed from a distance version she'd been allowing herself, just the real kind. The medical conference was in Chicago in September. She'd been invited to present before she'd fully registered what that meant. She almost declined. Then she thought about it honestly, without deciding in advance what the answer should be, and understood that declining because of Connor was not the same as not wanting to go. She was not going to let him continue to be the reason for things. She went. She presented on the first afternoon, a paper on care coordination outcomes for pediatric chronic illness management, 6 months in the making, something she was, without qualification, proud of. Connor was not at the conference. She had not expected him to be. He was in the hotel lobby. She saw him from about 40 feet away and understood, with the specific lack of surprise, of someone who had stopped being surprised by a particular person's choices, that he had found out she was presenting here through the mutual friends he'd been quietly calling for months. He looked older, not badly, just genuinely, like time had moved through him rather than around him. She kept walking. He stepped toward her. She stopped because the alternative was physically going around him, which she was willing to do, but which would take longer than whatever he'd come here to say. Darcy, his voice had something stripped out of it. Just a minute, please. She waited. I don't have an explanation, he said. I stopped trying to build one about 8 months in. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not what I think I did, what I actually did. She looked at him with the composure she had built, without intending to, over 2 years of navigating difficult things, with her hands steady and her mind clear. All right, she said. He blinked. He'd apparently expected something else. "That's all I have for you, Connor." Her voice was level. "I have a panel starting in 40 minutes and a flight home tomorrow, and a daughter who asked me this morning, what kind of bird has a gray body and a yellow beak? So." She picked up her bag. "I hope you're well." She was almost to the elevator when she heard Reese behind her. She'd sent him her schedule the night before, the way she'd started doing things lately, without ceremony, without requiring herself to analyze why, and he had apparently taken it as an invitation to simply show up. "How'd it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "About what I expected," she said, which was almost true. "Yellow beak, gray body. That's probably a black-headed grosbeak out of breeding season," he said, "or a yellow-rumped warbler if it's small." She looked at him. "I had a lot of time alone as a kid," he said. She laughed. "A real one, involuntary brief, the kind that arrives without being assembled, the first one in 2 weeks." He held the elevator door open. She walked through it. Connor sent a letter 2 weeks later, handwritten, which she hadn't anticipated. He wrote that he had been the one who told Whitney about the Seattle position. He'd called her because he was proud of Darcy and needed to tell someone who knew her, and he hadn't understood what Whitney would do with it. He said he understood that this didn't absolve him, that not knowing the consequence of a match you drop doesn't change the fire. He said he was going to issue a public statement corroborating her research record, not because anyone had asked, but because the record should be complete, and she deserved a complete record. He didn't ask for anything in return. He signed it with just his name. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning that was otherwise unremarkable. Celia was at school. Reese was at the hospital. The house was quiet, the way houses are when life has settled into something regular. She sat with the letter for a while. She thought about the person she'd been 2 years ago, standing in a hallway with a travel bag on her shoulder, and the sound she'd heard before she understood it. That woman had had no information about what came next. She had made the first choice without knowing where the road went, which was the condition of all important choices. You decide with what you have. The deciding is the thing. What comes after is built from it. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept things that were finished and occasionally still worth looking at. Then she made another cup of coffee, opened her laptop, and went back to work. Celia turned 6 that spring. She could read simple books on her own now, which she did with enormous seriousness, holding them at a slight angle that suggested she was performing reading as much as doing it. She had strong opinions about breakfast and about which shoes were appropriate for climbing trees, and she asked questions constantly and without agenda the way children do before they learn to be careful about curiosity. One evening in April, Darcy was on the couch reviewing charts while Celia drew at the coffee table, and Reese read in the armchair across from them, the 3 of them in the same space with the easy silence of people who no longer needed noise to feel comfortable together. Celia looked up from her drawing. "Reese," she said, "did you know the gray birds come to our yard in the winter?" "I did know that," he said, without looking up from his book. Celia considered this. "How do you know so much about birds?" "I had a lot of time to learn things when I was young." "Because you didn't have friends." "Celia," Darcy said. "It's okay." Reese looked up. The expression on his face was the one Darcy had slowly, deliberately stopped deflecting, the one that meant he was paying attention, had been paying attention, and had no intention of stopping. "Yeah," he said to Celia. "Something like that." Celia nodded, satisfied with this answer, and went back to her drawing. Darcy looked at the chart open on her laptop. She looked at Reese. She looked at her daughter's head bent over her work, Gerald the bear standing sentry at the coffee table's edge. She thought about a hallway in Chicago, a changed flight, a key in a lock, a sound she'd heard before she understood it. She thought about a travel bag on her shoulder and a sleeping 4-year-old pressed against her chest, walking out into a night that had no particular interest in what she did next. She had not known then what came after that night. She'd made the first choice without evidence of what it would build. She had the evidence now. It was right here, in this room, in the particular quality of a Tuesday evening that asked nothing from her and gave her everything. And she let herself know that, fully, without managing her relationship to it, the way she was finally learning to receive good things, as exactly what they were, not as something that needed to be held at a careful distance in case it disappeared. Outside, Seattle was doing what it did in April, the light going longer, the fir trees in the park shifting towards something richer, the whole city tilting gradually toward warmth in its slow and entirely indifferent way, which was not a cold thing. It was a freeing one.